Hermeneutics is the theory and methodology of text interpretation, especially the interpretation of biblical texts, wisdom literature, and philosophical texts. Hermeneutics was initially applied to the interpretation, or exegesis, of Scripture. It emerged as a theory of human understanding through the work of Friedrich Schleiermacher, Wilhelm Dilthey, Martin Heidegger, Hans-Georg Gadamer, Paul Ricoeur, Northrop Frye, Walter Benjamin, Jacques Derrida and Frederick Jameson. Modern hermeneutics includes both verbal and nonverbal communication as well as semiotics, presuppositions, and understandings. The terms hermeneutics and exegesis are sometimes used interchangeably. Hermeneutics is a wider discipline which includes written, verbal, and nonverbal communication. Exegesis focuses primarily upon texts. Hermeneutic, as a singular noun, refers to some particular method of interpretation. Hermeneutic consistency refers to the analysis of texts to achieve a coherent explanation of them. Philosophical hermeneutics refers primarily to the theory of knowledge initiated by Martin Heidegger and developed by Hans-Georg Gadamer in his Truth and Method. It sometimes refers to the theories of Paul Ricoeur. The field of Marxist hermeneutics has been developed by the work of primarily Walter Benjamin and Frederick Jameson. Benjamin outlines his theory of the allegory in his monumental Ursprung des deutschen Trauerspiel. Frederick Jameson draws on biblical hermeneutics and the work of Northrop Frye to advance his theory of Marxist hermeneutics in his influential The Political Unconscious. Jameson's Marxist hermeneutics is outlined in the first chapter of the book, titled On Interpretation. Jameson reinterprets the fourfold system of biblical exegesis to relate interpretation to the mode of production, and eventually, history. Etymology. Hermeneutics is derived from the Greek word hɛrməːnuːtɪks upsilon omega, from hɛrməːnuːtɪks upsilon sigma, of uncertain etymology. The technical term hɛrməːnuːtɪks alpha was introduced into philosophy mainly through the title of Aristotle's work Pi epsilon rho hɛrməːnuːtɪks alpha sigma, commonly referred to by its Latin title De Interpretatione and translated in English as On Interpretation. It is one of the earliest extant philosophical works in the Western tradition to deal with the relationship between language and logic in a comprehensive, explicit and formal way. The early usage of hermeneutics places it within the boundaries of the sacred. A divine message must be received with implicit uncertainty regarding its truth. This ambiguity is an irrationality. It is a sort of madness that is inflicted upon the receiver of the message. Only one who possesses a rational method of interpretation could determine the truth or falsity of the message. Folk etymology. Folk etymology places its origin with Hermes, the mythological Greek deity who was the messenger of the gods. Besides being a mediator between the gods and between the gods and men, he led souls to the underworld upon death. Hermes was also considered to be the inventor of language and speech, an interpreter, a liar, a thief and a trickster. These multiple roles made Hermes an ideal representative figure for hermeneutics. As Socrates noted, words have the power to reveal or conceal and can deliver messages in an ambiguous way. The Greek view of language as consisting of signs that could lead to truth or to falsehood was the essence of Hermes, who was said to relish the uneasiness of those who received the messages he delivered. Aristotle and Plato. In De Interpretatione, Aristotle offers a theory which lays the groundwork for many later theories of interpretation and semiotics. Equally important to later developments are some ancient texts on poetry, rhetoric, and sophistry. Aristotle's Poetics, Rhetoric, and on sophistical refutations. Plato's Dialogues, Cratylus, Ion, Gorgias, Lesser Hippias, and the Republic. However, these texts deal with the presentation and refutation of arguments, speeches, and poems rather than with the understanding of texts per se, as Ramberg and Gjesdal note, only with the Stoics, and their reflections on the interpretation of myth. do we encounter something like a methodological awareness of the problems of textual understanding. Some ancient Greek philosophers, particularly Plato, vilified poets and poetry as harmful nonsense. In the Republic, Plato denied poets entry into his ideal state until they could prove their value. In Ion, Plato famously portrayed poets as possessed. The meaning of the poem thus becomes open to ridicule. Whatever hints of truth it may have, the truth is covered up by madness. However, another line of thinking arose with Theogenes of Rhegium, who suggested that, instead of taking poetry literally, it ought to be taken as allegories of nature. Stoic philosophers further developed this idea, reading into poetry both allegories of nature and allegories of ethical behavior. Aristotle differed with his predecessor, Plato, about the worth of poetry. Both saw art as an act of mimesis, but where Plato saw a pale, essentially false, imitation of reality, Aristotle saw the possibility of truth in imitation. As critic David Richter points out, for Aristotle, artists must disregard incidental facts to search for deeper universal truths. Thus, instead of being essentially false, poetry may be universally true. Richter, The Critical Tradition, 57, Talmudist Hermeneutics. A common use of the word hermeneutics refers to a process of scriptural interpretation. Its earliest example is, however, found not in the written texts but in the Jewish oral tradition, dated to the Second Temple era, 515 BCE to 70 CE, that later became the Talmud. Summaries of the principles by which Torah can be interpreted date back to, at least, Hillel the Elder. Although the 13 principles set forth in the Baraita of Rabbi Ishmael are perhaps the best known, these principles range from standard rules of logic to more expansive ones, such as the rule that a passage could be interpreted by reference to another passage in which the same word appears. The rabbis did not ascribe equal persuasive power to the various principles. Traditional Jewish hermeneutics differed from the Greek method in that the rabbis considered the Tanakh to be without error. Any apparent inconsistencies had to be understood by means of careful examination of a given text within the context of other texts. There were different levels of interpretation. Some were used to arrive at the plain meaning of the text, some expounded the law given in the text, and others found secret or mystical levels of understanding. Vedic Hermeneutics. Vedic hermeneutics involves the exegesis of the Vedas, the earliest holy texts of Hinduism. The Mimamsa was the leading hermeneutic school, and the primary purpose was understanding what Dharma involved by a detailed hermeneutic study of the Vedas. They also derived the rules for the various rituals that had to be performed precisely. The foundational text is the Mimamsa Sutra of Jaimini, with a major commentary by Abhara. The Mimamsa Sutra summed up the basic rules for Vedic interpretation. Buddhist Hermeneutics. Buddhist hermeneutics deals with the interpretation of the vast Buddhist literature, particularly those texts which are said to be spoken by the Buddha and other enlightened beings. Buddhist hermeneutics is deeply tied to Buddhist spiritual practice, and its ultimate aim is to extract skillful means of reaching spiritual enlightenment or nirvana. A central question in Buddhist hermeneutics is which Buddhist teachings are explicit, are representing ultimate truth, and which teachings are merely conventional or relative. Biblical hermeneutics. Biblical hermeneutics is the study of the principles of interpretation of the Bible. While Jewish and Christian biblical hermeneutics have some overlap, they have distinctly different interpretive traditions. The early patristic traditions of biblical exegesis had few unifying characteristics in the beginning, but tended toward unification in later schools of biblical hermeneutics. Augustine offers hermeneutics and homiletics in his De Doctrine Christiane. He stresses the importance of humility in the study of Scripture. He also regards the duplex commandment of love in Matthew chapter 22 as the heart of Christian faith. In Augustine's hermeneutics, sign has an important role. God can communicate with the believer through the signs of the Scriptures. Thus, humility, love, and the knowledge of signs are an essential hermeneutical presupposition for a sound interpretation of the scriptures. Although Augustine endorses some teaching of the Platonism of his time, he corrects and recasts it according to a theocentric doctrine of the Bible. Similarly, in a practical discipline, he modifies the classical theory of oratory in a Christian way. He underscores the meaning of diligent study of the Bible and prayer as more than mere human knowledge and oratory skills. As a concluding remark, Augustine encourages the interpreter and preacher of the Bible to seek a good manner of life and, most of all, to love God and neighbor. There are 4 different types of biblical hermeneutics: literal, moral, allegorical, and anagogical. Literal Encyclopedia Britannica states that literal analysis means a biblical text is to be deciphered according to the plain meaning expressed by its linguistic construction and historical context. The intention of the authors is believed to correspond to the literal meaning. Literal hermeneutics is often associated with the verbal inspiration of the Bible. Moral interpretation searches for moral lessons which can be understood from writings within the Bible. Allegories are often placed in this category. This can be seen in the Epistle of Barnabas, which explains the dietary laws by stating which meats are forbidden but is interpreted as forbidding immorality with animals. Allegorical interpretation states that biblical narratives have a second level of reference that is more than the people, events and things that are explicitly mentioned. One type of allegorical interpretation is known as typological, where the key figures, events, and establishments of the Old Testament are viewed as types. In the New Testament, this can also include foreshadowing of people, objects, and events. According to this theory, readings like Noah's Ark could be understood by using the ark as a type of Christian church that God expected from the start. Anagogical. This type of interpretation is more often known as mystical interpretation. It purports to explain the events of the Bible and how they relate to or predict what the future holds. This is evident in the Jewish Kabbalah, which attempts to reveal the mystical significance of the numerical values of Hebrew words and letters. In Judaism, anagogical interpretation is also evident in the medieval Zohar. In Christianity, it can be seen in Mariology. Apostolic Age. The earliest Christian period of biblical interpretation was the Apostolic Age. Traditionally, that was the period of the 12 apostles, dating from the Great Commission until the death of John the Apostle. Because John lived so long and was the last of the apostles to die, there is some overlap between the Apostolic Age and the First Apostolic Fathers. The operative hermeneutical principle in the New Testament was prophecy fulfillment. Examples include Matthew chapter 1 verses 23, 2, 15-18, 3-3, 21-42, Mark chapter 1 verses 2-3, 4-12, Luke chapter 3 verses 4-6, 22-37, John chapter 2 verse 17, 12-15, and notably Luke chapter 4 verses 18-21. Jesus read extensively from Book of Isaiah and said that the prophecy was fulfilled in the crowds who heard it. The Pauline epistles also employ the principle of prophecy fulfillment, as evidenced by 1 Corinthians chapter 1 verse 19 and Ephesians chapter 4 verses 8-10. Apostolic Fathers. The Apostolic Fathers were followers of the apostles. This period is sometimes called the sub-apostolic period. The principle of prophecy fulfillment was carried over from the Apostolic Age and was continued up to the beginning of the 3rd century AD. For example, Irenaeus dedicates an entire chapter of Against Heresies to the defense of Isaiah chapter 7 verse 14, which was one of the chief prophecies used to validate Jesus as the Messiah. This is consistent with Irenaeus or other writings, even more than Irenaeus. The 2nd century apologists tended to interpret and utilize most scripture as if it were primarily for the purpose of showing prophecy fulfillment. Prominent among these was Justin Martyr, who made extensive use of scripture to this end. Examples of prophecy fulfillment can be seen in his Apology. in which chapters 31 to 53 are specifically dedicated to proving through prophecy that Jesus was the Messiah. He uses scripture similarly in dialogue with Trypho. Here Justin demonstrates that prophecy fulfillment supersedes logical context in hermeneutics. He ignores the Christological issues that arise from equating Jesus with the golden calf of Bethel, which is the him that is being brought to the king in Hosea chapter 10 verse 6. It is likely that the preeminence of prophecy fulfillment was a product of the circumstances of the early church. The primary intent of early authors was a defense of Christianity against attacks from paganism and Judaism, as well as suppressing what were considered to be schismatic or heretical groups. To this end, Martin Jan Mulder suggested that prophecy fulfillment was the primary hermeneutical method because Roman society placed a high value upon both antiquity and oracles. By using the Old Testament to validate Jesus, early Christians sought to tap into both the antiquity of the Jewish scriptures and the oracles of the prophets. Late antiquity. Two divergent schools of thought emerged during this period, which extends from 200 AD to the medieval period. Historians divide this period into the Ante-Nicene period and the first 7 ecumenical councils. Ante-Nicene period. The Ante-Nicene period of the history of early Christianity extended from the late 1st century to the early 4th century. Its end was marked by the First Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. Christianity during this time was extremely diverse, with many developments that are difficult to trace and follow. There is also a relative paucity of available material, and this period is less studied than the preceding Apostolic Age and the historical ages following it. Nevertheless, this part of Christian history is important because it had a significant effect upon the development of Christianity. First 7 ecumenical councils. This era begins with the First Council of Nicaea, which enunciated the Nicene Creed that, in its original form and as modified by the First Council of Constantinople of 381 AD, was seen as the touchstone of orthodoxy for the doctrine of the Trinity. The first 7 ecumenical councils, from the First Council of Nicaea to the Second Council of Nicaea, represent an attempt to reach an orthodox consensus and to establish a unified Christendom. The first scholar to study this time period as a whole was Philip Schaff, who wrote the 7 ecumenical councils of the undivided Church, first published after his death in 1901. The topic is of particular interest to proponents of Paleo-Orthodoxy, who seek to recover the Church as it was before the schisms. Schools of Alexandria and Antioch. As early as the 3rd century, Christian hermeneutics began to split into 2 primary schools, the Alexandrian and the Antiochian. The Alexandrian biblical interpretations stressed allegorical readings, often at the expense of the text's literal meaning. Origen and Clement of Alexandria were 2 major scholars in this school. The Antiochian school stressed the literal and historical meaning of texts. Theodore of Mopsuestia and Diodor of Tarsus were the primary figures in this school. Medieval period. Medieval Christian biblical interpretations of text incorporated exegesis into a fourfold mode which emphasized the distinction between the letter and the spirit of the text. This schema was based on the various ways of interpreting text that were utilized by the patristic writers. The literal sense of Scripture denotes what the text states or reports directly. The allegorical sense explains text in the light of the doctrinal content of church dogma, so that each literal element has a symbolic meaning. The moral application of a text to the individual reader or hearer is the third sense. The fourth sense draws out of the text the implicit allusions it contains to secret metaphysical and eschatological knowledge, called gnosis. Biblical hermeneutics in the Middle Ages witnessed the proliferation of non-literal interpretations of the Bible. Christian commentators could read Old Testament narratives simultaneously, as prefigurations of analogous New Testament episodes, as symbolic lessons about church institutions and current teachings, and as personally applicable allegories of the Spirit. In each case, the meaning of the narrative was constrained by imputing a particular intention to the Bible, such as teaching morality. But these interpretive bases were posited by the religious tradition rather than suggested by a preliminary reading of the text. A similar fourfold mode is found in rabbinic writings. The four categories are peshat, remez, dirash, sod. It is uncertain whether the rabbinic categories of interpretation predate those of the patristic version. The medieval period saw the growth of many new categories of rabbinic interpretation and of exegesis of the Torah. Among these were the emergence of Kabbalah and the writings of Maimonides. The customary medieval exegetical technique commented on the text in glossy or annotations that were written between the lines or at the side of the text. The text might be further commented on in scholia, which are long, exegetical passages, often on a separate page.